Hello, everyone. Thank you for joining us. I'm going to give it a few more minutes before we get started, just to let a few other people join. Hello, everyone. Thank you for your patience and happy Veterans Day. On behalf of the Environmental Finance Center Network, welcome to our webinar today on the benefits as well as potential pitfalls for small systems considering creating a bulk agreement. My name is Maya Bani from the Syracuse University Environmental Finance Center. Before we begin, we're going to go over a few housekeeping items and then we can get started. During the training today, everyone will be kept on mute to ensure audio quality. If you have a question, please type it into the GoToWebinar question dialog box anytime throughout the session. We will be saving your questions for a facilitated Q&A session at the end of the presentation. After the webinar, you will receive a follow-up email that includes a link to the recording and other information you may need. You can also download the slides from today in the Handouts tab in your GoToWebinar control panel. This session has not been submitted for pre-approval of continuing education credits, but eligible attendees will receive a certificate of attendance for their personal record. To receive a certificate for this session, you must attend for the entire session and register and attend individually using your real name and unique email address. Certificates will be sent via email within 30 days of the webinar date. If you have any questions or need assistance, please contact smallsystems@syr.edu. And now for a little bit about us. The Environmental Finance Center Network provides training and technical assistance to small water and wastewater systems in all U.S. states and territories through our building, technical, managerial, and finance capacity programs. If your community or utility needs assistance with drinking water or wastewater system management, please feel free to contact us through our request form, which I'll be sharing shortly in the chat. And on that note, we can get started. I would like to introduce our presenter for today, Anna Patterson, a project director for the Environmental Finance Center at the University of North Carolina.
Hi, everyone. Just to confirm real quick, you can see my screen?
Yes, I can see it.
Okay, good. Well, welcome. I'll just give a very brief background on myself for just a moment. My name's Anna Patterson. I am a project director for the Environmental Finance Center at the University of North Carolina. And my background includes working as a city planner for municipal government in Virginia. I've kind of bounced around. I also worked for the Sewerage and Water Board of New Orleans. So I've got experience with the water utility as well before coming to the University of North Carolina, working as a project director with the EFC. So I wanted to talk to you today about benefits and pitfalls of bulk sewer agreements. So why would you partner? Why would you enter into an agreement? Well, water and sewer systems, they need a high level of technical, managerial, and financial capacity to meet their obligations. And so there are high expectations that are set for you by the public and also by yourself. So when you're a small system, you need to be thinking about how you can manage all of those responsibilities. Okay, my slides are not advancing. Sorry about that. Okay, there we go. So I want to start by talking a little bit about capacity building, which is a process for your wastewater system to acquire and maintain adequate technical, managerial, and financial capacity. So TMF capacity enables wastewater and water systems to have the capability to consistently provide both safe drinking water, if you've got a drinking water system as well, and then sanitary services to the public. And most states have some sort of capacity development office, and they're a really great resource if you're thinking about developing your capacity. So capacity development is split into three categories, which I just mentioned a little bit. You've got the technical, the managerial, and the financial. And a partnership could help you improve in any of these areas. So when you're thinking about the technical aspect of your wastewater system capacity, you'd want to ask yourself about the adequacy of your infrastructure. And if your treatment and your storage and your distribution is adequate, and whether you have a certified operator as a part of your capacity. If you also have a wastewater system, you can consider the quality and the quantity of your source water as well. And then also your NPDES permit requirements and any other permitting requirements that you've got. So you'll also need to consider the managerial aspect of your system's capacity. So do you have appropriate staffing and organization? Do you have a history of your water or sewer rates maybe being too low? Do your decision makers understand the problems in your system? And do they know the financial options to address those problems? They might if you have a long-term plan for your system, but they might not if you don't have a plan. And maybe even if you do have a plan, they still don't quite understand. So it's in your best interest to have a clear capital investment plan or some similar type of document that you can use and you can show your board or your council or whatever, so that you can plan for the lifespan and the financial care of your system. And when we think about managerial capacity for small wastewater systems, we think of what's maybe diseconomies of scale. So that means the fewer households, as is often the case with small systems. Few households equals high cost a lot of the time. And a bulk agreement or a partnership can increase the number of users and decrease the cost if done carefully. So are you planning ahead? Your financial capacity is tied pretty closely to your managerial capacity. And So think about if your revenue is sufficient to cover your expenses now, and if it's sufficient to cover your expenses in the future. Do you have good credit worthiness? Are your rates adequate? Are there financial and fiscal management and controls in place? And if the answer to any of those is no, then a partnership could be a solution. And a mix of all three of these capacities is really what's required. And a partnership can help you improve these capacities if your system or if a neighboring system is lacking. So I'm going to briefly go over several types of partnerships and place them on a spectrum, and I'll also give you some examples. Now, a lot of our examples today are they kind of lean towards water systems, but don't let that get in the way, because it's really very, very similar to a partnership with a sewer system. And so these partnerships, they can range from loose agreements to more formal arrangements. And really each system or group of systems is different, but any kind of collaboration can be helpful. But it's important to remember that what works for one system may not work for another. Okay, so on the far left side of the spectrum is information sharing. And many of you may already be engaged in this type of agreement. This incorporates the technical and the managerial information, but it doesn't require any money to be exchanged or shared. And this could be something as simple as maybe calling the operator or the manager in the next town over and asking them how they handle particular situations. So here's a couple of examples. For Saipan in New Mexico, their facilities managers met monthly over lunch. You know, that it doesn't have to be in person. It could be, you know, just a Zoom meeting. They talk about mainly non-community systems. They meet, they rotate around different facilities and discuss common interests. So it's, you know, it's pretty informal. The Diana County Water and Wastewater Alliance have a similar setup, just meeting monthly, talking about their systems, maybe having an invited guest speaker. So equipment sharing is also on the less formal end of the spectrum, though it does incorporate financial capacity because your equipments are assets. So, you know, this is a common agreement among small systems who are able to share equipment and save on costs by not having to pay the full price of buying or renting equipment. And so a couple of examples here, Great Falls and Helena, Montana. They provide equipment and personnel to help tap water pipes for small nearby systems. And the larger systems bill for their employee time, for travel and equipment, and it benefits both the large system and the small system. In Tremont, Utah, which is the largest system in the area, they aid 30 smaller systems by distributing chlorine, lending equipment, parts, and supplies, and by establishing an organization to train the water operators of those smaller systems. So moving on, a buying consortium is a moderately formal agreement between utilities and communities that incorporates managerial and financial capacity. Through a buying consortium, systems work together to buy equipment, chemicals, or supplies. And the bulk purchase can lead to lower costs than if each of the systems were buying a reduced amount, you know, just for their system. It doesn't necessarily mean that equipment, chemicals, or supplies are being shared, but rather that they're being purchased in bulk and then distributed to each system to use what they need. They're not necessarily sharing. So of course, with a buying consortium, systems could also share both equipment and knowledge as well. So sharing might be the case, maybe not. It just kind of depends on what works for each particular system. And then the Southern Maine Regional Water Council is a good example. So the Water Council, they are a consortium which is made up of 7 utilities, and they serve 25% of Maine's population. And they've got set up a purchasing group, which is led by a chairperson who is appointed by the council's board. So they also have, a board. They're responsible for developing and awarding bids and purchasing packages. The bids are elective, so each of the participating utilities don't have to participate, but they have the option to. And they've saved on their costs of buying in bulk, and then their tank maintenance contracting also provided significant savings. Okay, so a mutual aid and emergency assistance. This is another moderately formal type of agreement that encompasses technical, managerial, and financial capacity. It's essentially a contract where systems assist each other during an emergency or during a time of need. And an example is a Water or Wastewater Agency Response Network, or WARN, which is a mutual aid assistance network that provides water and wastewater utilities with the means to obtain help in the form of personnel, equipment, materials, and associated services quickly from other utilities to restore critical operations that might be impacted during an emergency. And so by adopting the WARN approach, drinking and wastewater utilities in each state are able to sign a single agreement covering issues like indemnification and workers' comp, and also reimbursement. Unlike existing statewide mutual agreements, WARN membership is open to both public and private utilities. And this might be particularly helpful if you've got mobile home parks or other residents or agencies that have private water or wastewater systems. The agreement also allows utilities to share equipment, personnel, and other resources required to respond effectively to a crisis. WARNs also help utilities reduce the response gap, like that time between local agreements and activation of statewide assistance, since it doesn't require an emergency declaration. Each WARN enters into a mutual agreement that best meets their member system needs. And the agreements clarify liability, reimbursement, response procedures, and joint planning efforts. Okay, so I have a very quick video and I'm going to share that with you now. This is on WARNs. Okay, so that's a good option for communities that are just trying to get ahead and prepare for disasters, which unfortunately do happen from time to time. But obviously, there would be you know kind of some formal agreements that would need to be made and thought out. And I'll talk about some of the considerations a little bit later. Okay, my slides aren't advancing again.
If you treat, yep, beautiful, I can see it.
Okay, good. All right, so moving into the more formal range of the spectrum, are emergency or non-emergency interconnection systems, which have a physical connection that's only used during emergencies. So it's similar to a warn in that it's a response to a situation, but it's way more formal because the systems are tied together at some level. And they're ready to assist at a moment's notice. There would be a lot of pre-planning that you would need to do to actually tie your system to another, even if it is just for an emergency. Okay, so an example, Aurora, South Dakota, they've got a small population of just 500, and they're located 5 miles from Brookings, which has a much larger population. And Aurora was in regular violation for nitrate levels, and they didn't have a plant operator that was adequately certified. They didn't have the financial resources either to address this problem. And so they shared the cost of a transmission pipeline to interconnect their systems so that they could address those nitrate levels. Many systems have operational collaborations as well, and some of you might have them. These can range from more to less formal depending on what works best for your system. And this is where systems share an operator or contract with the same operator or the same operation company. Many small systems can get by with just having an operator work half-time or maybe even just a few hours a week. So by sharing an operator, systems can have access to a certified operator, and then your operators can retain that full-time employment, which is very important. Panora and Des Moines, Iowa entered into this type of agreement. So Panora was a very small community that had trouble retaining staff, and they signed an MOU with Des Moines to allow Des Moines to monitor their treatment plant remotely. So this limited the need for an on-site operator to just 2.5 hours a day. And then, the larger utility got the revenue from the payments from the smaller, and then the small utility gained access to the operators that they had trouble recruiting for full-time employment. So, if you are having trouble recruiting operators, which we hear from small systems regularly that is a that is an issue. So this might be something to consider. Systems also collaborate at the managerial level without having to be interconnected. This is more formal because, again, if you're dealing with a board or some sort of management structure that's governing multiple utilities, you are going to need to have more of a financial or more of a formal collaboration that encompasses all 3 TMF capacities. So even more formal, moving to the right on the spectrum here, you can form a regional entity, either as a separate option from the existing utilities or as the only option. In a regional entity, this style of partnership, all the systems have a role on the board, and they all retain some level of control or say in the system. And then the most formal is where one system dissolves into a neighboring entity. So in this type of partnership, the dissolved system, they lose their independence completely and only one utility remains. Okay, so I have a poll. So I'm curious at this point if you're interested in a bulk agreement or a partnership. And so yes, we already do them. No, we're not doing them, but we would be interested, or no, we're not interested. Let's see, are you guys seeing the poll on your screens?
I am getting feedback and answers, so it looks like people can see it.
Okay, good. How does it look?
I'm gonna leave it open for about 10 more seconds, and then I'll close it out and read out the results to you.
Okay.
All right, closing in 3, 2, and 1. So to response, are you interested in bulk agreement or partnership? The results were 39% no, but we are interested in exploring options. 35 is no, we are not interested, and 26% is yes, we already do them.
Okay. All right. Well, that's helpful. I'm glad to hear that some of you are doing them or interested. And if you're not interested, that's okay too, because if you're doing great, then that's awesome. I do have a follow-up poll. So if you are doing them or if you're interested, what are you interested in? So the informal partnership would be like information or equipment sharing. The moderately formal would be something like a WARN or sharing operators. And then the formal partnership would be something like joining your system under a joint leadership with another, or maybe dissolving your system or having another system dissolve into you. And then of course, none is also an option.
About 15 more seconds, I'll leave the poll open for. Closing in 3, 2, and 1. For what kind of partnership are you most interested in? 57% said moderately formal partnership, 22% said none, 13% said formal partnership, and 9% said informal partnership.
Okay. Well, that's great. That's helpful for us to know what you guys are interested in. So thank you for participating in those. Okay, so we've been over some of the types of partnerships and the bulk agreements that you might decide to enter into to either save money or to gain access to technical capacity. Obviously, there are some concerns with collaboration though, like desire to maintain autonomy, mistrust for other systems, lack of knowledge of other systems, lack of knowledge of your options, or no outside independent force to get a collaborated started. So what can you do and where can you start? Well, first, it's a good idea to just take a look at the big picture. So what do you hope to gain out of the partnership? Some of the benefits that a partnership can lead to are long-term savings resulting from economies of scale, better planning for future operations, increased TMF capacity. And then at the state level, you may have improved compliance with permit requirements, improved customer relations, and then your customers might notice an improved water quality or reduced long-term costs and increased reliability. You also need to ask yourself, what is there to lose? How can you protect your system, and how can you protect your water sources and your discharging water bodies, as well as your customers when you're entering into an agreement. I'll discuss some of the important parts of the negotiation agreement a bit later. But first, I do have another brief video. Again, this video is made for water systems. So excuse that language. I know this is a wastewater system webinar, but the same considerations would need to be made for sewer agreements as well. Okay, so it's important to have a thorough understanding of what you want to get out of the partnership. Um, the organization needs to have an agreement from the leadership on down regarding the goals. And the goals for each party need to be clearly articulated to the others. So before approaching another organization, it's a good idea just to get together internally and discuss your system's goals. So, what are the problems? What are the challenges? How could a partnership help? And, kind of treat that as a brainstorming session. Because the partnership likely won't go smoothly if you don't know what your goals are. It can be tough to figure them out midway, and then have to either backtrack or just move forward with something that maybe isn't what you exactly had in mind. So make your goals specific, measurable, attainable, realistic, and time bound. These are what we call SMART goals. So as long as they meet those metrics, then you'll have goals that you can reasonably meet. So we've been through some of the types of partnerships, and these are just some kind of names for those partnerships that are familiar. So direct acquisition. So this is one. Higher capacity utility absorbing another. You could have a joint merger. So two or more utilities is often the case, but not necessarily of a similar capacity, consolidating to become a new entity that is joined or jointly owned by the participating utilities. You could have a balanced merger. So this could be a hybrid of the other two types, and involves two or more utilities consolidating and creating a governance structure that's designed to allow for participation by the previously existing utilities in decision making. And then you can have a consolidation of governance or of operations or management. And these are some names for the type of collaborations that were at the far right, formal end of the spectrum. These all require a good bit of the pre-planning, and negotiations before a contract is signed, as do those kind of middling agreements, which the majority of you said that you were interested in. So you may want to make these considerations before entering into any type of agreement, a looser agreement as well, like equipment sharing. You still want to make considerations. So first, you need to assess the feasibility of your consolidation options. You'll want to create a task force to determine how well a consolidation will work for each system involved. Each system will most likely want to obtain legal counsel, especially if you're on that formal end. Maybe it's less important if you're just information sharing, but legal counsel can be very important. You should also be holding public listening sessions to solicit input from your customers. Hear their needs and their concerns so that you can incorporate those into your partnership. You should also be arranging for engineering, facilitation and planning assistance to assess what you have and what you need. And with all pre-planning stages, it's important to have transparent financial analysis. Be able to make potential future scenarios so that each party understands what they're getting into and what to expect down the line, so that future disagreements and even litigation can be avoided. So you'll want to consider ambiguities related to the current and the future service areas. This might be through annexation or growth, or maybe population decline. So in your contract, you would need to include language defining service areas. You would need language defining who can serve an unserved area. So if you're annexing, who gets to serve those customers? Language clarifying the process for changing or expanding service areas in the future. You'll also need language to clarify costs associated with changing service areas, so how it will affect your rates. Change is inevitable. So if future growth changes your customers' rates, you'll need to know what to anticipate. And having these considerations laid out and agreed upon ahead of time, it'll make that process go more smoothly by preventing internal competition to serve the same areas or new areas on down the line. So water and wastewater system assets are often the most valuable thing that a government owns. So it's important to define and to value them in a partnership or a consolidation. So in addition to determining the book value and the cash flow value of all your assets, you should be determining who maintains them and who owns given parts of a system's assets, because that will provide accountability in your billing for services. And then knowing the value of your system will help you advocate for a fair deal in the agreement as well. And here I'm going to briefly make a case for asset management. And we do whole trainings on asset management. So I've only got a couple of slides because they're related. So as your level of service increases, your costs are often going to decrease. But utilities, like all service organizations, have competing priorities. And systems need to determine how to focus their efforts, resources, activities, and their time to best address these competing priorities. So when you're thinking about asset management, you're going to want to determine what level of service do you want to provide for your customers. What's the criticality? So what's the overall business risk based on the probability and the consequences of asset failure? Do you have a critical piece of infrastructure that has a short lifeline? You would need to know that for your own well-being. You would also need to share that with a partner. So your life cycle, do you have a strategic plan for operation and maintenance? What is the process based on risk going to look like? Do you need to rehab? Do you need to replace anything? And are you thinking about energy efficiency? These are just all considerations to make in asset management. You would, of course, need to think about funding. Do you have funding sources? Do you have capital replacement and energy efficiency improvements? Do you have debt? If you're entering into an agreement, you would need to disclose that debt to your partner, and you would need to expect them to disclose theirs to you. And then finally, what assets do you manage? Where are they? And what condition are they in? What is their usefulness? These are all important things for you to know for yourself if you're not in a partnership, and if you are, you need to know and to share that information. You need to know the current state of your assets as well as your partnering utility, especially if you're more interested in that formal partnership. Because you wouldn't want to enter into a partnership with a system without knowing that a critical piece of their infrastructure was failing, and maybe they didn't have a replacement. Likewise, you wouldn't want to hide that information, whether intentionally or not. Maybe it's an accident, but either way, you need to be on good terms. So in a partnership, you would want to consider how to handle these emergency situations. Maybe if pressure drops in one utility, you need to have a game plan for how that'll affect your partnering utilities, Or maybe if one system's exceeding their TMDLs, how does that remediation affect the other systems? So, whether you plan to partner with another system or if you're perfectly fine on your own, asset management is pretty crucial. But if you are interested in entering into a partnership, you need to address outstanding obligations and responsibilities like debt and staffing issues. Let your partner know if you have, maybe SRF loans to repay. How can that debt be covered if there's no longer revenue being generated to pay that debt? That would be under a system dissolving. But what about your staffing losses? If you do consolidate, you might have to lose staff for a small system. How can it be harmonized? This knowledge ahead of time can really prevent unwanted surprises down the road. You also need to consider how the partnership is going to impact your customers' rates. We like to think that partnerships are win-win, but lower rates are not a guarantee. Will your customers have a surcharge? What about a temporary increase? How long is that increase going to last? Will the rates among consolidated utilities be equal? And how are you going to achieve that? Rates are often the #1 concern for your customers, so be prepared to have this conversation early in the process. Have some idea when you do a public listening session or if you solicit feedback to the public, because they're definitely going to ask. So you need to consider governance structure for a consolidated utility. If you're consolidating, the governance is going to change, and it might be dependent on the number of utilities, the combined service area, the anticipated population growth or decline, the financial health of your systems, and the future regulatory costs. And this may change over time. So, if one population has a boom, maybe you end up on some travel bloggers TikTok, and you have just a sudden population explosion. It may shift unexpectedly, and you would want to have a game plan to address that. You would also want to consider the board representation for the utility. So think about the number of board seats and the rationale for assigning the board seats, the number of utilities on the board, the rate setting process, and how that board can be modified if there's growth or change. So, does the biggest utility get the most seats, or does everybody get the same number of seats? Does it change, as the population changes? Again, you want to anticipate and expect this, because governance will impact every aspect of service provision. So, and finally, you want to prepare for disputes. They're inevitable, and hopefully enough consideration has been made ahead of time that you can kind of dictate how to handle these disputes. If not, though, you should consider how to deal with conflict. Many local governments opt for binding arbitration. It is limiting, though, since it prevents the appeal or appealing decisions, and precludes formal litigation, which may end up being necessary. So instead, contracting entities may prefer a non-binding mediation process, since the option of formal litigation is still available. Some disagreements are, they're just going to happen. So it's best to try to prepare for them in the way that's going to be best for your utility and your customers under an agreement. So just again to reiterate, communication at all levels is key. Between parties, between managers, and between operators. So the easiest thing is to start with informal conversations with each of the potential stakeholders. And the stakeholders include the town, the city, local county planning and economic development officials, and your customers. So Allow time for stakeholders to clearly state their goals. You don't want to make assumptions because they might be wrong. And then once you enter into a partnership, that communication, it needs to continue, and to continue in a clear manner. And you need to continuously inform your partners if something drastically changes with your system, or whether you do have, some sort of emergency situation. For example, if you're selling water to someone and they're going to have low supply, are you sharing a source and you notice contamination? Those types of things you're going to want to tell them ASAP. So the more you know about your system, the better your partnerships can work. I can't stress that enough. And that is the end of my presentation. So if there are any questions, I can take those here. If you have any questions after we're done, though, my email is here, so please do feel free to reach out.
So I do have a couple questions here for you.
Okay.
One is, does the EPA or anyone have sample agreements of each type, or sample contact operations agreements that utilities could review and become familiar with?
There are. Maybe I actually looked at this just a couple of days ago. I can send that to you, and maybe you can distribute to the participants. Would that work?
Yeah, we can include that in the follow-up email.
Okay. Yeah, so I will include some information about different types of agreements that the EPA does have on their site.
All right, thank you. At the moment, it doesn't look like we have any other questions, but feel free to send those in as we close up. Actually. One more question. Is it possible for a partnership to be with a mutual domestic and a private utility that is transferring?
Do you mean between like a public-private partnership? If that's the question, then yeah, that would be fine. Again, you would want to just consider ahead of time all of the things that I laid out, but especially with that private utility, you would also want to think about funding opportunities, because public and private utilities are not always eligible for the same funding sources. Private utilities are a lot more restricted, so that would be a major consideration to make before you enter into an agreement with the private utility, whether they can access, state and federal funds.
All
And
right,
that would
great.
probably be determined based on your specific state. I know this is a national webinar, so we've got folks from all over. You would want to check with your state representatives.
All right, I think that wraps up our questions for today. And is there anything else you'd like to add before I close up our webinar?
Well, I just want to thank everybody for being here. If we do have any veterans on the call today, happy Veterans Day. If you've got any questions about this or about anything else with your small water system or your small wastewater system, go ahead and reach out. We've got a good network within the EFCN, so we can provide technical assistance and just answer questions.
All right. Well, thank you, Anna, for sharing your expertise with us today. Following this webinar, you will all receive a follow-up email with slides from today and a link to the recording. We also ask that you complete the webinar evaluation following the webinar so you can let us know your thoughts on today's session, as this helps us plan future webinars on topics important to you. Thank you all again, and we hope to see you at future Environmental Finance Center Network events.